lunch. I hope you're enjoying your food. So I think we'll get started since we have a limited time. So welcome to the early modern Southeast or Indonesia food talk. This event is part of the workshop that we've been running since yesterday that focuses on early modern period transitions in Southeast Asia from 1400 to about 1832 CE. The focus of the roundtable today is to discuss how culture contact, European expansion, and responses of groups in Indonesia, especially how this interactions shape Indonesian cuisine. By the way, I'm Stephen Acabado. I'm assistant professor of anthropology here at UCLA. I'm from the Philippines and I'm from Bicol. I eat chili peppers for breakfast. My region is known for chili peppers, but we know that chili peppers came from the New World. It was brought by the Spanish to the Philippines. But I thought growing up that chili peppers is endemic to the Philippines. But apparently, as the roundtable today will show, this period starting from about 1400 AD shaped our palates, shaped our culture, and also the identity of Southeast Asia. So today we are fortunate to have top scholars working in Indonesia who will provide us with recent studies or directions of Indonesian history. We have Dr. Peter Lape from the University of Washington, Dr. Leonard Andaya from the University of Hawaii-Manoa, and Dr. Barbara Watson Andaya, also from the University of Hawaii-Manoa. We would like to thank the Indonesian Studies program for feeding us and for supporting the workshop that will end tomorrow. Terima kasih.
So we conferred amongst the three of us, and after a long planning period, we decided I'm going to go first. And we're going to go around and around, but also we're going to invite all of you to ask questions or provide comments or tell us how good the food tastes. So I'm the token archaeologist on the panel, and so I'm going to start because I have the oldest stuff to talk about. And I thought I'd talk a little bit about, has anyone heard of the somewhat recent trend towards paleo foods or paleo diets in the U.S.? I thought I'd talk to you about paleo Indonesian food to give you a sense of kind of the deep history of Indonesian food and as a background to early modern Indonesian food, which is of course, the dishes you're eating right now really represent thousands of years of food history. That's what's so cool about them. And I love eating food. I love talking about food. So make me stop if I go too long. So I work in a part of Indonesia, in eastern Indonesia, which became famous in the modern period as one of the world's sole sources of certain really important spices that we think of as foods today, or flavorings for food. So the islands that I worked on originally in my career were the Banda Islands, which is where nutmeg comes from. And I just published some work this past fall during pumpkin spice latte season. Do you know that? I had an article come out that I found evidence for use of nutmeg by people 3,500 years ago. So this spice, although we think about it as a kind of one of the drivers of globalization and modern foods, it has this ancient history. Maybe not as a food. It also has psychotropic properties if you eat enough nutmeg. I don't know, can anyone raise their hand if they had too much nutmeg? Apparently if you have 3 kernels of nutmeg, if you eat them, you will have a trip that lasts for 3 days.
You're starting a trend.
I don't recommend that.
Nutmeg.
Nutmeg.
Where could they have gotten that idea?
They're not recording this, right?
It's used for that purpose in the Upper Amazon, the Virola, which is related. It's a
Oh, really?
Myristicaceae family also. With
Interesting.
myristic fragrance, which is not.
Yeah. Okay. So archaeologists who are interested in food, like me, face a challenge in that food is primarily organic material, and it does not last very well in the archaeological record. You kind of have to get lucky to find ancient evidence of food. If you like to eat food that contains seeds and you roast that food, thank you, because you're providing archaeologists those roasted and carbonized seeds will last for thousands of years, and we can identify those later and figure out what you ate. But if you like to eat starchy things like boiled potatoes, I'm not very happy with you because those things will disappear very quickly. And of course, starchy foods are often kind of the bulk or the most important calorie-producing parts of diets, and it's very, very hard to get information about the deep history of those starchy foods. Sometimes, though, starch grains do preserve in the right place, like on the insides of cooking pots. And I dig up lots of pieces of cooking pots in my sites, and you can look at those under a microscope and sometimes see those preserved starch grains and sometimes identify them.
No rice.
Rice starch does preserve sometimes, but we don't find it. And I do want to talk about rice. So, so we find foods through. Speak louder. Okay, I'm at a 9 right now. I'm at a 9.5. Maybe I'll stand up. Would that be better? Okay.
Or you could use that.
Is it the microphone or just people can't hear me? Okay, that's better. Okay. So we find burned seeds. We find sometimes pollen from plants, and we find these starchy residues or chemical residues on eating and cooking things. We find bones of animals. So if you eat animals and you discard their bones, those will often preserve in archaeological sites. In fact, they're often the better preserved between plants and animals. We usually have a better picture of animal foods compared to plant foods. And this has implications for the labor of getting those foods. Archaeologists have tended to think that animals are the realm of men, that men tend to get those animals for eating, and women tend to be in the realm of plants to get those plants. And so we have maybe undervalued women's contributions to ancient foods. And I think Barbara's going to talk a bit more about that from a historical perspective as well, which is really interesting. So that's kind of how we know what we know. And I guess the big answer is we don't know that much as archaeologists. We have this very spotty record, lots of holes in it. There's lots of things we don't know about ancient diets. So we turn to Indonesia, which is even worse because it's in the tropics and it's hot and it's wet, and preservation of ancient materials is even worse than in drier or colder places. But we do know a few things about ancient Indonesian foods. So we turn to the Paleo-Indonesian diet, and you look at what we're eating today. We've got a yellow rice. We have green beans. We have a chicken dish with limes and cilantro, it looks like, and some kind of noodles with, I don't know, what's the meat in there? Is that chicken as well?
Yeah.
So chicken. So a couple chickens, an egg. Okay. 5,000 years ago, none of those foods would have been available. What you're looking at here is basically a post-Neolithic food stuff, and actually rice is probably even later. And Dr. Akabatos has some opinions about that, as you heard earlier. So before we had farming and introduction of some of these foods, probably the starchy foods were things like wild yams, maybe some wild taros. So these are root crops, which you find taros, for example. There's hundreds of species of taro. The kind of center of diversity of taros is in the Philippines or maybe northern Indonesia, Sulawesi area. So lots of taros on the landscape for people to eat, usually a lot smaller than domestic taros you might know now. Same with yams. They're an Asian wild plant that you find basically everywhere in Southeast Asia. Lots and lots of different varieties of yams. They're usually little babies. They look like little small potatoes, the wild ones. Domestic ones are much bigger. But we do find starch evidence of some of these early foods on stone tools in Indonesia. This is kind of a new area that any of you who are interested in archaeology and want to look at this. This is an area we need more work done to understand these early foods. In terms of animals, so there's a lot of variety of animals across Southeast Asia. Indonesia, which is the island part of Southeast Asia, parts of Indonesia were connected to mainland Asia during the ice ages when sea levels were lower. And so you have those big Asian mammals like rhinos, tigers, the big mammals that would have been all over mainland Southeast Asia. And people ate those things. So once you move into the parts of Indonesia that were always islands, even at the lowest sea levels, so this is more eastern Indonesia, basically you kind of run out of big animals to eat. You tend to have these smaller islands. You've got rats. Rats and bats are kind of the animals, and lizards are the bigger bodied animals that are available to eat. There's some really big rats. So I've never tasted one.
Giant forests, bamboo.
Big rats.
Yeah, big, like small dog-sized rats. So like on the island of Flores in Indonesia, which was always an island, we get these very small-bodied hominins, so 3-foot tall people eating these giant rats. And there's also little baby elephants walking around as well, so really kind of a cool magical landscape of foods. The worst meal I've had in my life, I had on the island of Timor. I was serving in caves, this is about 10 years ago, and we forgot to bring lunch with us as we're walking around surveying these caves, and we were very hungry. It's about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We've been hiking, and so I was with a group of guys who were bird nest hunters. They were gathering these bird nests to sell to Chinese traders for bird nest soup. And we said, we're so hungry, maybe we should go back. And they, no, it's cool. We got lunch covered. So we sat down and they walked into this cave. We had just discovered this new cave that turned out to be a pretty important archaeological site. They walked in there and they grabbed bats out of the air as they scared them up and they started flying out of the cave. They just grabbed a couple bats. They borrowed my plastic water bottle. They cut the top off and stuffed these still squiggling bats into the water bottle. Stomped on it, and then built a small fire of little twigs and put the water bottle bat sausage onto the fire where the plastic shrank as it goes. And it squeezed the bat hair and blood and bones and teeth into this little sausagey thing, and then they sliced off the water bottle, and that was our lunch. Worst meal I've ever had. So it was basically bat blood tinted with plastic, burning plastic.
They're still eating lunch.
Yeah. So your food is much better than that. So this is the downside of doing archaeology, just so you know. But presumably Paleolithic bat cooking was more highly developed. And I've had actually a very good bat soup in Indonesia. And catching bats in Indonesia, there is a tradition of kite fishing for bats. So you fly a kite and you dangle a little hook on it with some bait, and the bat will come grab it out of there, just like fishing under the water. But you air fish for bats. That's so cool, I think. So let's see. There's also some very important foods in the Paleolithic times that we still see some evidence of today. So bananas. Bananas were probably domesticated maybe in 2 places, but one of them was probably New Guinea. So the big island of New Guinea, which part of it is part of the nation of Indonesia now. There's lots and lots of wild banana varieties there, and those were available to people in the Paleolithic times, and those were good eating, even the smaller wild bananas. And also nuts were really important. So things like canary nut, canarium tree, which you find throughout Southeast Asia into the Pacific. They're big trees that are really prolific. They're sometimes called tropical almonds. And I was thinking we might get some canary sauces to a very popular Indonesian sauce on eggplant, which one of my favorite foods is canary nut sauce on eggplant with garlic and salt. It's delicious. So that would have been a Paleolithic food and probably a really important source of protein and oils for people eating. So let's see. The kind of the big revolution in Indonesian food happened in what we call the Neolithic Time. So this is a term, it basically means new stone or new stone age. And in many parts of the world you see with the introduction of farming and domestic animals, you also see a change in stone tool types from these kind of chipped stone tools to more ground, sharpened stone tools. It's not a great rule, it doesn't always hold true, but kind of typically that happens. So in the Neolithic in Indonesia, which starts about 3,500 years ago, you see a radical change in diet. So the introduction of especially 3 or 4 new domesticated animals. So we have pigs, introduced domestic pigs. We have chickens, domesticated chickens, and we have dogs. And all 3 of those dogs were eaten and still are eaten in parts of Indonesia today. But the chicken you're eating today is an inheritance from this Neolithic time. And there's wild ancestors of chickens running around in the Philippines still to this day, but they were probably domesticated in southern China and then brought or transferred into Indonesia from China. Pigs and dogs as well probably came from domesticated sources in southern China. You also have a new suite of plant foods. So probably the most important are domestic yams. So these are the bigger Asian yams that you can get in supermarkets today. It's very confusing. There's what we call yams in America because of marketing. It's often a sweet potato, which is an American domesticate, and they look kind of similar. And it's often hard to tell them apart. Actually, they're about the same size. And the labeling in the supermarket's very confusing. But there's definitely an Asian yam that would have been an important Neolithic food. Taro is possibly a Philippines domesticate, or maybe Indonesia. So one of those wild varieties was crafted into this kind of bigger corm or bulb edible species that was planted and groomed by people. And so in that site where I found that early nutmeg, we also find yams and taro starches on the pottery. What else comes in then? So I guess domestic bananas show up at this time as well. Kind of an interesting New Guinea import, so coming in from a different direction than the north. Trying to look through my list of food here. Yeah, that's about it for this kind of starch. Oh, and Sago. And so Leonard and Andaya is going to talk about Sago in more detail. And archaeologically, we don't know much about when Sago first appears, and so I won't say much about it because he's going to describe Sago in detail, right, and tell us what it tastes like.
I want more background.
But Sago was grown all over Indonesia in after Neolithic times, and it's still very popular food in the place I work in, eastern Indonesia. You won't find it in Indonesian restaurants in the U.S., I don't think. I've never seen it anyway on the menu. Oh, maybe a dessert,
Sometimes
yes. That's right.
Gula Melaka.
Gula Melaka.
Yeah, exactly.
Boba
Boba tea. Is that Saga?
Yeah, boba tea.
Oh, is it? Oh, I thought it was tapioca.
It's
It depends.
Okay. I have a lot to learn about Sago, obviously. Sago is a really tough one to see archaeologically because the starch grains really do not last very well. And Sago palms a palm tree that you actually eat the wood. You cut down the tree, you split the trunk open, and you pound up the wood, and you rinse it out, and you get this very fine, starchy flour. And so you always cut the tree down before it pollinates, because after it pollinates and flowers, it doesn't taste very good. And so you don't even have a pollen signature for Sago. So it's a really hard one to see archaeologically. Okay, I just wanted to talk about a couple other ingredients post-Neolithic time, so to bring us to early modern times. And then I'm going to turn it over to my wonderful panelists. By about 800 years ago, Indonesia is becoming a place where other people are coming to visit, and they're bringing their foods with them as they come. And many of the popular ingredients in Indonesian food today are the inheritance of this kind of a intersection of trade and migration that happened starting, in the last 1,000 years. So Dr. Akabato mentioned chilies. I can't imagine Indonesian food without chilies. Sambal, some of the sauces. I think there's some sambal up here. That hot flavor of many Indonesian foods is totally a recent import. The last 500 years probably from the Americas. Other important imports are things like peanut sauce, which we think is a very traditional thing. So peanuts were domesticated in Africa, and they're part of this kind of global movement of food ingredients. Tomatoes, I think there's some tomato in the sambal, but tomatoes are part of ketchup, which is I think a Malay word. Do you guys know? One of the few Malay words that's entered English, ketchup, which wasn't always tomato-based, but now the ketchup we know, the Heinz 57, is a tomato-based sauce.
So ketchup run amok.
The other word that came in. Yes, thank you. I think there's like 4 words. Yeah. So cassava is another very important Indonesian food now. So it's a New World plant or American plant that comes in and kind of takes over from Asian yams in many cases because it's easier to grow. It grows in poorer soil. It's more productive per acre. It takes a little less work to grow than yams. It's also more pest resistant. And then rice. So there's a big fight in archaeology right now about rice. And your person here at UCLA, Dr. Akabato, is on the forefront of that battle, and I'm on his side, by the way. Well, the battle is rice an ancient Indonesian or island Southeast Asian food, or is it a recent import? And so the one camp says that rice comes in the Neolithic times from China 3,500 years ago. So some of our prominent colleagues like Peter Bellwood are big proponents of this theory. It's kind of part of their theory package, that rice is part of this Neolithic food package that moves into Indonesia. And then there's those of us who went looking for this rice in the archaeological record and don't find it. It's not there, except for a few exceptions that Peter Bellwood highlights in his work. So in Borneo, for example, there's fairly old rice grains found in pottery sherds, kind of stuck inside the pottery. But most of the time, we do not see rice until very, very, very late. And Dr.
Do you think it maybe came in as a trade?
We think the reasons why rice comes in, I think, are really complicated, and I think it's a really interesting. It has to do partly with industrial production. Rice is a great food if you have to feed a lot of people and you have a lot of labor and the right kind of landscape to make it happen. It's not a great choice for a more dispersed, less industrialized place because of the labor input and the kind of intensive nature of it. But rice is delicious. And I think some of the reasons why people like rice now is that it's a little bit sweeter on the palate than some of the other starches. And when I've talked to some food ethnographers, they talk about this sweetness as a real driving factor that moves people to different foods. And we see, of course, the rise of sugars in our food now. Sugar's everywhere, right? Any industrial food you eat now pretty much has sugar. Even if it's supposed to be salty, it has sugar in it. So we've seen this movement towards rice, and rice is like the signature food of Indonesia. You can't imagine Indonesian food without rice, and yet it's pretty clear that it's a fairly recent introduction.
Shelf life.
And shelf life. It lasts for a nice long time, when you dry it. Yeah. So a few other foods I just want to mention, and maybe you guys will pick up on this. We were talking earlier, I think Miriam and I were whispering together about the importance of leaves in Indonesian food, leafy greens. So these really do not leave a great archaeological signature, and yet they're very important, both nutritionally and for flavor. Salt. I'm fascinated with salt production, and salt is really critical to the tastiness of food and also preservation. Things like sambal and ketchup required salt for preservation. Sugar. So there's palm sugars which are you basically tap a palm tree and you distill, boil down the sap to make these sugars. I love palm sugar; it's so good. And honey also. We talked about honey in our workshop a little bit as a thing that people are gathering from landscapes to sell. And then alcohol, maybe not officially a food, but I think alcohol and drugs drive a lot of trade and labor input because we become so addicted to them and we need them all the time. So the alcohols we might know in Indonesia, a lot of these have been hidden because of Islam. So under Islam, alcohol is really not super cool. And yet, of course, people are still drinking, most of them. All my friends who are Muslim in Indonesia drink secretly. I won't tell on them on camera. But alcohol is really important, and it's got this production aspect to it. So there's the sugar palm tree makes this sap that if you just let it sit for a few hours, it ferments in the tropical sun, and that makes a really nice drink. It's kind of like a 3 to 4% alcohol. It's good for lunch, and then you can distill it that afternoon and make a 10 to 20% or higher if you double distill liquor, and it often is called arak, which is probably a Arab word, and there's lots of other local words for this distilled liquor. But you'll find when I retire, my retirement project is going to be to go around Indonesia and record all the stills and all the technology for stills, and then also do a taste tour. But I found the most amazing still technology, using bamboo, using World War II bomb shells, all kinds of crazy ways of making this liquor. There's also European imports, so things like beer. When I excavate archaeological sites that date to post 1700 in Indonesia, it's mostly gin bottles and beer bottles. It's like that's all these guys did was drink gin and beer, and I think those ships must have been full of just bottles of liquor, and then they went home with spices or products from Indonesia, but the ballast was alcohol, just a remarkable amounts of alcohol. And then the drugs, I started by talking about nutmeg, but there's in tropical forests, there's so many medicinal plants that humans have figured out over time, and kind of recreational medicinal plants that people also figured out over time. And there's also imports, things like tobacco, that are, Indonesia now is the land of smoking. It's like the last refuge of smoking, I'd say. I smoke when I go there, much to my wife's despair. I can't help it. It's the way you talk to people is by smoking with them. So those drugs have also kind of entered the mix now in the modern period. So I think I'm going to stop there and turn it over to these guys because they have lots of interesting things to say. And I also want to encourage you to interrupt us with questions and your observations or your knowledge. So thank you.
Hi. Thank you all for coming. I'm Barbara Watson-Andaya from University of Hawaii, and this is a hard act to follow, but so I'm moving up into the early modern period, which we date roughly from 1450, roughly to about 1820, kind of give or take. And as Peter was saying, this was a period of lots of new foods coming in. So foods have status. What you eat, in a way, defines what you are. So as we have these societies meeting, these cultures meeting, you have to know if you're going to have a party, what are you going to feed people? So I worked with Dutch sauces a lot. So the Dutch were invited to a feast and they were fed frog's legs, or whole frogs. That was not, or beef jerky or salted fish. This was not something that they thought was up to their status. So it's a time when food assumes a status of its own. One of the best examples that I'm going to cockroach from your pinch, we say in Hawaii, cockroach from Leonard's work. But one of the rulers in eastern Indonesia, when he wanted to drink Dutch beer, he always put on a Dutch wig, because he was changing his identity from being a Muslim to being a kind of a European. where the Dutch also in the area that I work on, southeast Sumatra, always trying to keep Chinese ships away. But they would go down to the market and they would find something that doesn't grow in Sumatra. And they would know that a Chinese ship had come in. In fact, the Dutch word for oranges is Chinese apple, sinaasappel. so this changing the status attached to food starts to become extremely important with entertainment, with diplomacy, but underneath all that, and the whole issue of food production is a gendered issue. As some of you know, I have written a book on women in this period of time, and one of the areas where women were intensely involved was food production at all levels. They cooked the food, they helped grow the food, and so it's very difficult to ignore their role in any history of food that you try to produce. Peter talked a little about leaves and a collection of leaves for food production, but women did a lot of that because around, at a farming area, around a home, that's where they were foragers. And foraging for leaves and vegetables or wild foods is much more productive than hunting. Hunting is very unpredictable. You might not know whether you're going to find something to kill or not, but collecting leaves is very predictable. So a lot of food, even today in places like northern Thailand, a lot of food depends on this food production. But women also use that knowledge of plants and local production for medicines. So women were often the primary doctors in this part of the world. And Europeans relied on them intensely because they found that the kinds of cures they'd brought for dysentery and didn't work, and that often they would go to a doctor who was likely to be a woman for some sort of medicinal knowledge. But then also too, because women were cooking with pots and they were actually working with pots. We find that on the Korat Plateau, for example, the pots there have striations in the pots which are thought to make it cooler or keep it hot and keep the temperature inside. And it is thought, it's speculated, of course we can't prove it, but it's speculated because those were often pots used for food cooking or food storage, that that was a female idea, that they should do that they experimented because women were also pot makers. But I want to, since Peter talked about the import of food, I want to talk about women also as gardeners, because women's work is basically around the house. So it was women primarily who were growing the vegetables or growing, and so important crops like pepper, the history of pepper planting began in those gardens, and then it later on expanded into larger plantations. But often imported food began in a vegetable garden. But because rice, you're all eating rice, and because it's so important, the gendered role of labour in rice production in Southeast Asia historically very, very deep roots. People have done comparisons of wheat and rice production in China and wheat and rice production in India. And they've found that in areas that produce rice, women have a much higher labour role than they do in areas that produce wheat. And that applies in Southeast Asia as well, not only in wet rice, not only in irrigated rice production, but also in dry rice and rain-fed production as well. But in irrigated rice in particular, as many of you have some rice background will know, the initial planting is in a nursery. You have to grow the rice plants and then transplant them into a flooded field. And because the rice goddess, particularly in Java, which I know best, but in other places, the rice goddess was conceived of as as a child, as a rather fragile young lady. Because the rice goddess was female, you needed the delicate hands of a woman to transplant the seedling from the nursery into the flooding rice field. So if you see pictures of rice planters from the old, there's always women planting rice. I think some of you know that Filipino planting rice is no fun. Ben from Mornington said, the sun cannot stand, cannot rest for a little bit. But it's women who are doing that hard work, and it has medical problems as well. A lot of prolapse, lots of difficulties with medical health because of that work labour. But it does mean that even in harvesting, the ane, the small rice knife for everything had to be cut by hand, and it should these women's tools. And threshing the rice, of course you could thresh the rice but the best rice was threshed by women, treading very, very carefully on the rice grains like that to separate the husk from so it was the whole process was, in other words, what I'm trying to say, if women were not involved, the community couldn't eat. The women were absolutely essential to the whole production of food. So it had implications as well. It meant that the role of women in the family was very strong, so that gaining a wife was very important. You had to, the whole concept of bride wealth, of compensating a family for losing a daughter, for the daughter, for the gift of daughter, I should say, was very important. That for the many parts, not everywhere, but for many parts of Southeast Asia, a young man went to live with his wife's family. So, as an early modernist, I can produce you many quotes where people say the more daughters a man has, the richer he is. Because the more daughters he has, the more sons-in-law he has, and the more wealth he has. So unlike China and certainly Vietnam, in many parts of Vietnam, a girl was not a temporary resident in her family's house. Now, I'm getting away from food somewhat, but this domestication of food production. Should I stop?
No, please go.
has very important implications when Islam came, because I talked about the status of food, and religion has a very, very important part to play in that, and it's quite remarkable how quickly people see not eating pork as a sign of being Muslim. It becomes the quintessential indication that you've accepted this new faith. It may have proceeded somewhat slowly in some places, but as far as records are concerned, it becomes the sign. These people are Muslim, they recite the Quran, and they don't eat pork. That had affected, particularly in eastern Indonesia, has remarkable effects in Indonesia, because the wild pig, is the largest animal east of Makassar. There are no elephants or big, large animals. So it was the ritual animal. So pigs were killed when there was a ritual occasion. In some places, the pig's blood was used in ceremonies. The same in the Philippines too. So if you're now saying this animal is unclean, that has ritual implications, but it has implications for women as well, because women looked after the domestic animals, and they looked after the pigs, and they looked after the piglets. So women might even breastfeed a piglet if it was in danger. And Dutch sources say, it's remarkable to see these women. They look like Parisian women, but instead of their dogs following along, they have their little piglets coming with them. So in those areas, for a community to become Muslim meant a very significant gender shift in gender roles, not only in ritual but in care and responsibilities. So, but even in other things, when Pigafetta arrived in Borneo in eastern Indonesia in the early 16th century, said, yes, you know, people say that if you're a Muslim and you're eating chicken wings, which had now been introduced, if you're eating chicken wings, you have to cut them down the middle. You have to cut off the tips of the chicken wing and then cut it down the middle. That's what Muslims do. So food becomes, in many ways, an indication of a changed cultural status. I was going to, I should leave. I wanted to talk, just make a couple of mentions of two, and then I will turn it over, then you have to talk. Two things that came in the wake of the early modern period. One of them was coffee. Now, how would we function today without our Starbucks? My daughter won't drink there at all, but she's a Brooklynite. But coffee came into Southeast Asia in this period from the Yemen. And it was initially grown, people were losing the leaves. They would dip the leaves in water, and these coffee leaves would flavour the water. I've never tried that myself, but that's how people in central Sumatra, for example, were drinking, not with the roasted beans, but with Europeans, because at this time in Europe, tea and coffee houses were really growing in importance. So as we have a growing European population and ladies, Eurasian ladies are marrying European men, and they are exchanging visits. What do you have? If you're not drinking beer or brandy, you have a cup of coffee. And so there are some nice pictures of Batavia in the 17th century with Eurasian women drinking their coffee, exchanging their coffee out of Chinese teacups. So this movement became very, very important, but it was also important in other areas of life, because in the Middle East, Sufis in particular were drinking coffee to keep them awake at night time when they were chanting their zikr. And so that also coffee drinking became also part of the mystical Islamic kind of community. So it also assumed a religious dimension as well as a physical aspect, as just for taste as well. And then the other area that was a very new product in this period of time was opium. So opium, we sometimes associate opium with Chinese opium dens and so forth. But the governor of Malacca on the Malay Peninsula said in the middle of the 18th century, Malays cannot live without opium. And many Javanese, many people all over Southeast Asia were addicted to opium. And it made a huge difference to British trade, because the British at this time controlled the opium areas of India, in Bengal. And opium is a different product from anything else, any other product that was produced in this period. Why? Because it's addictive. So you can live without pepper. You can live without oranges. But if you're an addict, the first English clipper to cross the Bay of Bengal, the first one to arrive, could charge what he liked for the opium in the chests he was carrying. So and why were people addicted? How did they become addicted? Because opium was used not as the Chinese, I think, were using it in the 19th century to escape labor and hard work and poverty and just a desperate life. No. Southeast Asians initially began to use opium for warriors to raise their defiance in times of war. It made them braver and courageous and more able to withstand pain and more reckless, you might say. And so it was, in the 17th century, it was said that it was mixed with tobacco, but not mixed the way we would think of. The opium was soaked in water, and then the tobacco leaves were in that water and then dried, and then they would be smoked like that. So it was a mixture of tobacco and opium. But in the words of Francois Valentin, the Dutch minister, he said, all the Javanese are opium eaters. So at that time, opium was seen as a kind of as a food that people consumed. And so we were asked to think about how these connected with all these foods and so on, connected with Indonesia today. And I was just thinking when I was looking at opium, you know, worldwide, we're in this real issue of drug use, and that's spread to Indonesia as well. Often people are taking drugs in cocktails. They don't know what the mixture that they're taking. But I think the history, when we write the history of drug use and why it is taken, we'll be able to see these kind of cultural changes. Why do people take it? Because of desperation or food or for excitement or whatever it is. And opium may well be part of that long overall history. So I'm just going to stop now, I think, and turn it over to my friend and colleague.
So I guess we're a disappointment to you because we're supposed to be talking about rendang and gudeg and all those things. But we're focusing on other things. And one of the reasons is that the early modern records that we have don't really talk too much about food. I mean, people love food. We eat, when we get together, anytime you have any kind of gathering, you have to have food. But for some reason, it's not mentioned in the sources. In the indigenous sources, it may be because these are court records and you wouldn't talk about rendang, right, while you're talking about these momentous things happening around the world. So what we get is just bits and pieces of what may have been eaten as an ordinary kind of food or food that is very useful or whatever. So what I thought I'd focus on, Peter's already mentioned sago and how it was made. Now, one of the interesting things about sago is that if you look at the early modern period, so just to remind you again, it's about plus or minus 1400 and 1830s, we consider the early modern. If you look at the early historical material for Southeast Asia in that period, particularly in the island world, what you find is the staple food that they eat is sago, not rice. Even the Malays are eating sago. So that what you find is that the rice is something that is introduced later on, and it becomes associated again, as Barbara was saying, with status. So the elite will eat rice, and the ordinary people will continue to eat sago. But one of the interesting aspects about sago is how long you can preserve it. You wouldn't expect it. So when I was doing research in eastern Indonesia, same areas as Peter, one of the things that I saw was the production of, or it's not production, it's just the villagers going out and making sago, because sago is created from the wetlands. You get these swamp palms that produce this sago, so that you get a certain tree that you can then cut into sections, and then, as Peter said, you can put it on a horse. Then they make a cutting here, and they make a fine tilt, and then have the water flow out. But what is interesting about it is that when they collect that milk from that tilth, they collect it in these baskets, which are woven from the leaves of the sago tree. And because it takes a while, and you can't just take that and then go home, if you're going to make the trip out there, you're going to spend a long time there. So what they do is they keep them in those containers, and they keep them fresh by putting them back in the water. And it's only when they're ready to leave that they gather all these things and bring them home. Now, what is interesting is that when you get the fresh sago, which is much more moist and watery, you make it for soups and so forth and so on, so that they become dumplings. So you put it into your soup, fish soup, whatever, and then the dumpling itself has very little taste. So what you're doing, you're absorbing the sauce from whatever thing that you're making. So people love it because it is very, very nice tasting. But as the I was going to say years, but that's not that long. As the months go by, you can't use that fresh sago anymore. So what they do is they bake it. So they bake it in these little containers. So you can find really old things with little sections where you pour the sago in and you bake it, and then you dry it. And after you dry it, you put it together and you keep them in your rafters until you need them. And so you can have all these rafters full, not only of sago, but also of dry fish. And I was just going to tell you a story. We're talking about the best lunch he's ever had. My best lunch was that I was traveling around because I was stuck on an island. I couldn't get out. So I used to go down to the harbor every day to ask all the captains of all these little boats, where are you going? Can you take me? I finally got a ride with this Bugis trader in his boat, which is over full, and there was nothing to eat. I mean, it was a very long journey. So what they did was they just passed around the sago and the dried fish. And the sago is so hard, you can't bite it. And so I didn't know what to do with it until I saw somebody stick their hand over the boat. It was one of those boats. You can stick your hand in and you put it in salt water and it makes it soft and you eat it. And then the dried fish was so dry, it was like eating paper. And so that's what I ate. And that was it's not as bad as yours, but it was really pretty awful. But what is interesting about this is that sago suited the early modern communities, particularly those who were traders, because they could go for very long distances and even areas where they weren't certain about food, they could carry all that sago and that dried fish. And this was carried on also by the Europeans. When the Europeans came in, for example, like when the Dutch went in to try to remove a lot of the clove trees and nutmeg trees because they wanted to keep the price of spices high, they brought expeditions from the villages and from the Dutch. And what they did was brought also huge numbers, not tons, but several pounds or 100 pounds or 200 pounds of sago and so forth for the people. And not only for the Indonesians, but for the Dutch. And they also see, if you look at the import of sago into some of these places, like Batavia, there's a lot of sago import as well. And these are for the garrisons, the Dutch garrisons who are posted all over the Indonesian archipelago. So they learned how to eat sago as a necessary food. So it's one of the things that you think about when you're working the early modern period, that there are certain things that are there and they appear in the records in ways that make you think about why is it being used so commonly here and not there. The other thing that is very much traditional food is betel nut. Yeah. People chew betel nut. And some archaeologists have drawn a line between where you eat betel nut and where it stops, and then you drink kava, which is in the Pacific. And so the line ends right after eastern Indonesia. It goes a little bit into western Pacific. And then after that, it's all kava. Kava is what you this root you chew and you spit it out in this big bowl, and then you all drink it. I think betel is a little bit more hygienic, but it's a very, very difficult thing. I can never, where I was doing research, when you go into the house, they offer you betel nut, right? It's already chopped, and you add the lime and the betel leaf, and you roll it and you chew it. I did it once and I almost fainted. I guess it was the narcotic element. I mean, I just felt very dizzy, and so forth. And so from then on, I had to ask my friend, what do I do? And he said, well, people are very understanding because you're orang asing, right? You're a foreigner. They'll allow you to do it. So he said, just hold the betel nut in your hand while they're all chewing, and they'll be okay. So that's what I did. I just received the betel nut and held it in my hand. But this is the kind of thing that you realize after a while too, that betel nut is really very important. So if you go into the markets in many of these places in Eastern Indonesia, and even in Central Java and some places in the Batak areas, you'll see a lot of these betel nut. Because what you do, this is for you guys if you're going to go out in the field, if you're going to be visiting the family where betel nut is being chewed, you go to the market and buy some betel nut, and then you just present it to the family. And then they'll be very, very pleased and so forth. So this is the kind of thing that you also see. This is part of the food culture of these areas, that you offer these elements to your guests, and you then are able to carry on in a social way. Now, the other thing that is very Southeast Asian is, of course, what we call in Tagalog patis, right? But the Ilocanos have something called bagoong, which is even stronger, right? And then you get all of these kinds of nokmam, all the fish sauces all over the area. And this is true of Southeast Asia as well, that they have this sauce. And so what you find also is that many of the kinds of food that you have is basically the staple food plus some kind of a sauce. So, the Indonesian term lauk pauk, right? So what is the real food that you eat? It's the rice or whatever staple you have. The other things are just flavorings. And remember not the North Koreans, the Koreans. The Koreans also have that thing, right? They say, I want some little, I don't know what they call them, appetizer or something that you add to the rice. That's right. Okay, here we go. So that you get those things. So that it is always the case in Southeast Asia. So you don't need enormous amounts of meat or things. And if you get leaves, and leaves are something that many Southeast Asians eat. I remember because my parents are migrants to Hawaii, but I was born there. But one of the things I remember, because we lived in a plantation camp, and my neighbors were Japanese or Koreans or Portuguese or whatever, and they always said, the Filipinos are really funny. They eat all kinds of leaves. But it's true. We eat all kinds of leaves. You got pumpkin growing, but the pumpkin is only one part. You eat the flowers, you eat the leaves. You find all different parts that you eat. So in Southeast Asian cuisine, you learn how to eat what's around you. And so this is the kind of thing that we kind of ignore. And it's not something that is so important that you have it in your documents, right? They wouldn't be talking about these things. But we know from kind of experience that this is the kind of thing that goes on. And so when you get new foods coming in, which happened in the early modern period, it kind of introduces different kinds of cuisine into the area. And that's when you get major changes in the kind of ways that people operate. So Peter has been talking about all these foods that come from the Americas. We attended a medieval dinner once at Cornell, and what they did was to serve food where? At Australian National University. They served food that was there before the Americas was founded. And it was terribly boring, right? I mean, it was nothing. I mean, turnips and what was it? Turnips and I don't know. And then
and no forks.
No forks, and they were using big knives to cut whatever. But the food was so bland, and you realize that with the Americas, you've got complete transformations. And one of the things that made a tremendous difference in Southeast Asia was corn or maize. Because one of the things about that is that you can plant corn in very poor soils. And that meant that there were many more people who could go into marginal lands and create fields and have corn as a supplement to whatever other major staple they had. And again, I can't tell you how they ate it because it's not there in the sources. But from field work, when you go there are two instances where corn was used. The most common, of course, is ikan, not ikan, but what's the word for corn? Mice. Jagung. Jagung bakar, right? Jagung bakar is corn cooked over the coals. And that's a very, very common way of doing it. And I feel this is probably some of the ways that it was first eaten. And they never ground it to make tortillas or whatever. So it's kind of interesting that they just ate it the way it was. But the other way that I saw very in Indonesia, which I'd never seen anywhere else, they mix corn with rice, right? So that when the rice is getting low, to make it last longer, you add corn, and then you cook the corn with rice. So that you get these kinds of ways in which they've adapted the food that's come from the outside. And so what you find in Southeast Asia is a kind of adaptation of the kinds of foods that are coming in. Now, one of the things that you find also the Chinese brought in is the different kinds of cakes that they used to make. So in the Malaysia, they call it kueh nyonya, right? I mean, these are kinds of cakes that all these, the women, mostly the mestizo, the Peranakan women, the women who are half Chinese, half Malay, make. And you can find them in the stalls everywhere you go. But the same cakes are found all over Southeast Asia. And many of them are found in the urban areas where the Chinese were located. So I think some of these things now, we don't associate it with the Chinese, but they were part of the Chinese cuisine that came into Southeast Asia. So this is something, again, that we know. And then we also have the word pan. The Japanese have it too. Ampan, they always talk about pan, right? Bread, pão. And so that you also find in different parts of Indonesia. When you get Portuguese communities, they've introduced the idea of bread. And so one of my memories about living in Jakarta, which I didn't like at all because it's so loud and noisy, but one of the things that you do in the early days when I went there is people yelling at roti. Nowadays nobody does that, right? It's roti, and you come out and you buy your bread, and so this is the way it happened. So that people started to kind of have bread as well in their cuisine, and we're talking about beer, but the other thing that they did also introduce was wine, and so when they swore oaths of allegiance, the indigenous way was the mixing of blood and drinking, and then maybe smashing eggs with a stone or whatever. But the Dutch introduced the idea of drinking wine as well to celebrate. So some of them also started to drink wine as a way to cement a relationship. So that you get all kinds of different ways in which outside foods had been adapted to Southeast Asia. So I'll just leave it here because you probably have much more interesting questions you want to ask of us. So thank you. Yeah.
Why do you think the cuisine hasn't translated as well to the rest of the world as much as Chinese, American, Indian food would be? Unless you guys already covered that before.
No.
That's my question too. Like in Seattle where I live, we've got 1 million Vietnamese restaurants and Thai restaurants, and there's 3 Indonesian restaurants. It's a great sadness to me.
Yes.
Immigrants. Not as many immigrants.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I think so.
No, it's very interesting. I mean, you complain about the lack of Indonesian food, but the Filipinos have more to complain, right? There are not as many Filipino foods, and one of the reasons for that one is that there was a review, and they were describing this new Filipino restaurant that opened, and it's
In Honolulu.
in Honolulu, and the woman said it was like having you know, when you ate the food, it was like having your face slapped. So I don't know, that's not a very good description of Philippines. But Indonesian food doesn't seem, I'm not sure what it is. Because I love Indonesian food, but
Yeah.
people aren't used to it. I guess
I
the
don't know.
blending
Yeah.
of tastes.
Yeah,
Not sure.
I don't know. It's very puzzle. It's a puzzle.
Do you think it's the spices?
No, because Thai food is hot too.
But not spicy, but like specific,
All the specific
Flavorings.
spices.
you know?
That could be, yeah.
Gong or-
Yeah.
But you know, you'd think that peanut sauce would be something that people would like, and they don't like it. You know.
Or
But-
there's probably just limited number of entrepreneurial.
yeah,
Indonesians.
that is. Yeah.
There's so many ways to make the roti canai and all the
Yeah.
different rotis that are delicious.
Yeah.
I'm surprised that it hasn't caught on more, but I think Susanna's right, it's an immigrant issue.
Not as many.
Where
Yeah.
they come from.
Right.
I could keep going.
Yeah.
You want to ask about the bats?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, hi. Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. For Dr. Barbara Watson-Andaya, hello. I was wondering how opium might have been used in spiritual practices, particularly by women.
Oh, sorry, how opium was used, particularly in spiritual practices by women.
That I think is. I doubt whether women. Smoking is. In much of Indonesia has not been a female thing, unlike Burma.
For the
Um,
Philippines.
Or
Philippines.
Philippines too, yeah. So, and because zikir, the tariqat kind of practices were primarily male, and women's devotions were at home and private, I very much doubt whether in those kinds of cases any kind of opium. I don't think that opium was involved in religious practices particularly. It was coffee and I was talking about primarily, but I think opium would have been classed. I have no indication that opium was being used in religious practices with any kind of approval.
Could I just add, I worked in the northern Philippines, and the spiritual practitioners were women, and they went into a kind of trance, and trance is, as you probably know, is really common for women healers in Southeast Asia. In Cambodia, also it's women who go into trances, but I don't think they use drugs.
No, it's. I went to a trance session in Thailand, and you know, people who are able to go. I mean, they can just.
They just snap it.
They just snap into it. Yeah, you know, they just go, and so it sometimes there's a lot of preparation in some cases, but for people who do it on a regular basis, so they don't really. I think Professor Stark's right. You know, they don't really need any assistance to do that. They can just do it.
The rice wine that Ifugao Mumbaki, Ifugao religious practitioners drink is spiked with something because one party they ran out of baya. They gave us what the Mumbaki was drinking, and I had no idea what I did for 5 hours.
That's interesting.
It's better than.
There's a question there. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, Amazonia is famous for its fruits, and it's basically described that more than 85% of its domesticates, in fact, are fruits, not starches and so on. So I'm curious about, we know that there's some very famous Indonesian and South Asian fruits, but I'm curious whether the same level of domestication of, let's say, the fruit arcana is as widely practiced, if domestication or semi-domestication is as much a feature, and also how does it show up in the archaeological record as well as the cultural record?
Well, I'd say it's a big unknown area, and actually I wrote fruit on my notes here, and I neglected to talk about it because it's really important. You go to a market, and it's mostly fruits.
Are just crazy.
Yeah. And I was thinking about when I lived in the Banda Islands, a boat would come in from Serang with whatever was in season, and people would run to the market and just were desperate for fruit. So there's like almost a need for that sweetness and the sourness of fruit in your diet. But the archaeological work is, I'd say, not done yet. It needs to be done.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just going to comment on the definition of the area that we're talking about. Which Miriam started off yesterday saying it's arbitrary, this definition of insular Southeast Asia. But if you, and I agree, because when you look at some of the fruits, like Canarium almond that you were talking about earlier,
Committee,
pardon me?
Committee.
Community.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, the genus is Canarium, and Canarium indica is the main species. Anyway, get for the domesticate is all the way far into Micronesia as an important marker, evidently of academic sites. And at the same time, the same genus goes all the way around to Madagascar into Africa. Not the same species, but probably with similar uses in terms of that ability.
Yeah, Dorian Fuller, someone who's done a lot of the really good work on this, looking at kind of global movements of fruits, prehistoric movements like the work on bananas and a lot of things going to Africa that are really early.
They found some banana fibers, I think, in Aden somewhere.
Yeah, exactly.
Another issue.
That's interesting.
But also Sago,
Right.
is very important all the way from the Solomon Islands
Yeah.
into Indonesia.
All various forms
So
of
it's called
sago.
Lape. So if we look at the area, it depends on how you, that's why it's arbitrary, because there are certain things that are excluded, other things that are included to define it. So it's a helpful discussion
Right.
for
But even
understanding the area.
right, because in the eastern Indonesian part, the sago trees are not the ones in the swamp. They're the dry sago, and the way they eat it is in the sappy form. They make sugars from it, and that's what they eat when they particularly. It's a good one to counter any kind of starvation and so forth and so on. It's pure sugar is what they eat.
I'm curious about how the diet differed according to how the diet of the people differed according to this class structure. Was there any food that was considered royal food, and there was food that for the common people, and how has it evolved? Because I'm assuming that if there's a scarcity of certain type of food, that should be primarily for treated as food for the royalty, but as farming practices have improved, I'm sure those food had become abundant. So, like, what were amongst all the food that you've mentioned? How was it characterized or distributed amongst the people according to the class? Like, I'm really curious about that.
Well, I think, it depends a tremendous, Southeast Asia, as you know, is an area of huge diversity. So the difference between, somebody who was called a Raja, who would translate as king in Western Sumatra, a German observer said, they're like our mayors, So the difference between somebody in that capacity and his or sometimes her subjects was very slight. There would have been very, very, very little difference because despite the title, the status, the actual was quite low. But it would be reflected in things like right now. When you get to much higher ranking, I think with Southeast Asians, one of our old professors said Southeast Asians have always wanted to be up to date, so that counts for food as well. So any new or imported valuable food would be much more likely to be there on the elite tables. And that often related to these gin bottles. They probably weren't only the Dutch who were drinking the gin. I think it related to these kinds of new imports. But whether something like corn translated from marginal areas where it was being planted up to elite tables, I have what Leonard was, what we've been saying is that for the kinds of records that we use, this is food on the whole is not something that gets a lot of attention. When I look at shipping lists, for example, I see that onions were a huge they took up a lot of room on boats. I guess they had a long shelf life, but they were widely used in cooking. But it's something that it's only there because I see a shipping list. Nobody says onions are very important. We need to buy, the price of onions has gone up or anything like that. So it's, you really, rice is the only thing that you really start where the fluctuations in rice matter. And in those kinds of situations, of course, if you can pay more, you would still be able to serve. So I think your question is a really good one, but very, very, very hard to answer. But what we do know is, of course, there were times of huge scarcity, and particularly in basics like starch, like rice. So if the rice crops failed, so when people did starve, particularly in parts of Vietnam. I think the documentation of Vietnam is particularly good for the 17th century, where they really like now. Some areas were very, very vulnerable, and because transportation was very few ways of transporting food from food-rich areas to food-poor areas. So maybe some of the other people have comments. Maybe.
I'll just make a comment and then our colleague should talk. But I'm thinking about this resilience question and the issues of starvation. And one of the things that you see, at least in Amazonia and in the Latin American humid tropics or lower tropics, is the importance of palms. And I think Bill will chime in on that one. And also, even though they might not be used all the time, they certainly are hunger foods in the case of the American tropics here. Lowland, they're semi-aquatic, riparian kind of thing, so that they actually produce, they operate very well as hunger foods. So, and perhaps were even regularly planted as hunger foods for threats and so on, so that they move across the landscape in a very particular way. So I'm curious, under the kinds of conditions where we have strong climate events and so on, what do palms emerge, or do certain kinds of plants emerge as kind of resilience foods, hunger foods, or not? And if not, what would you speculate would be why not? Because of course, in Latin America, what you have is everybody dies from measles, as they are right now in the United States. Right
here at UCLA.
There should be an authority. Well, fashionable spots, always at the forefront. But this question about hunger foods and the severity, or is it an access thing? Is it declines in mobility so that you couldn't even get to these areas, or that you couldn't produce these areas over time? This I'm thinking of the Nakuk stuff in Colombia.
I was thinking, I was going to think of how to characterize Indonesia food-wise, and land of plenty is kind of what I thought of originally. That you don't see a lot of evidence for kind of mass starvation, kind of the episodes you see like in Vietnam or other places. And I think it's a stable climate. Your access to seafood is really, really critical. We haven't really talked about fish, but we should for Indonesia. But I think there's also there is talk of starvation foods or hunger seasons in Indonesia. And I was thinking about Robert's talk about how this like of the new and the import. In hungry times, often you go back to these older foods. So like the Asian yam is often talked about as a hunger food. If you're eating rice all the time, you love rice, but things are bad and you run out of rice, you've got yams forever.
Wild taro, where you have to process it before you can.
It's interesting to think about these resilience things in light of the kinds of dynamics that we're going to see in the future.
Great.
I was just going to ask if, but getting to a question that was asked about elite foods. If you see it archaeologically, I don't know if you know some of Mickey Dietler's
Yeah.
work in,
Yeah.
in Europe and Liza DeGento's stuff specifically on these 17th, 18th century trading sites. There's certain deposits that they think are associated with feasting in these sort of trade contacts that contexts where people were bringing out interesting foods, that aren't perhaps on the normal, including gin bottles and wine bottles as well. And we do it today, right? So
Yeah.
nothing like that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, feasting is hugely important. I
Yeah.
mean, any kind of event like this
Yeah.
involves
Food.
eating together,
Yeah,
and
different kinds of
and it
foods.
drives actually its ceramics. So you
Yeah.
start to see
Yeah.
the Chinese serving
Yeah.
big platters, creating big
Yeah.
stoneware platters for this, replacing banana leaf platters or
Yeah.
something like that. So it's this communal eating thing.
Yeah.
I did have a student looking during the Dutch colonial period, looking at were the Dutch eating so differently from their slaves, and what she found is no, actually,
The same- eating the same
pretty
thing.
much the same. Yeah,
Laura-
which was
Laura
surprising.
Younker did a little work. It's a little less grounded maybe because it's not so historically linked, but in the late pre-Hispanic period, which we would call now early modern, and she was arguing that she could see some feasting in the form of higher proportions of meat parts, animal parts, right? No, maybe.
I think
Ish.
if she looked at the amount of domesticated pigs, then that's definitely feasting.
Okay.
But I don't think she talked about
Specifically.
because at least in Ifugao and the Cordillera, once you see domesticated pigs, that's for report.
It's funny because working among the Ababta nomads in Southeast Egypt, we had feasts because we were opening a community center, and basically it was the same food. It was sand-baked bread, but it was very big, and there would be no way you would see that archaeologically.
Yeah. The problem within the tropics and probably also in Egypt is like if you have a big animal like we call them $300 pigs in Timor because that's how much they cost. But a really big full-grown pig. Once you kill that pig, you have to eat it right away. So you save it up for a big party. And if you have a buffalo, it's even bigger probably.
So I'll hate to. So we can continue our discussion later for dinner for our feast. Right? Chris is scheduled to give a talk.
Peter, when they have a big feast,